It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Colonel Allen West. I have to read this. One thing. I got to say one thing. People ask me, or people ask, where are the next Pattons, where are the next Omar Bradleys, and so on and so forth, and the reply is often they get fired when they're lieutenant colonels. And the reason is because the guy standing right next to me here is a guy who did something during his last tour of duty that was brilliant and it was wonderful, and NCOs will never forget it. He will never call himself a hero, but I will. Colonel West.
Thank you. I want to make sure I do it right. I don't want to get up here and screw up in front of you guys. But it's a pleasure and an honor to be here on a fantastic night, to get the opportunity to set the stage for someone that is near and dear to my heart, someone that is truly indicative of a warrior. But I want to take just a few minutes to talk about something that I think is near and dear to our hearts and puts us in the right mindset to hear Carolyn Glick speak. It was 183 years ago in a place kind of south of here called Gonzales, Texas, that when tyranny stood before people that wanted to have liberty, and tyranny came by the way of the Mexican cavalry, and they asked for their cannon back. And there in Gonzales, they made a stand. And they said those words, "Come and take it." And it is interesting because on that symbol that Texans know so very well, you have that cannon and you have that very identifiable star that is above that cannon. And it's so important because that star has come to be one of the most recognizable symbols, no matter where you go in the entire world. That lone star, that star of Texas. When you think about what happened the following year, February into March, 13 days, when 185 stood at a place in San Antonio de Bexar called the Alamo. And when they were faced with insurmountable odds, they stood and they said, victory or death? They chose death instead of choosing to surrender or retreat. See, tonight is about recognizable stars. It's about the star of Texas, the Lone Star State, and what it means to people in the United States of America, what it means to people all across the world. Because when they see that star, I remember being in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and driving through, and there was a little Afghan boy, had a T-shirt with the Dallas Cowboy star on it. But it's not just that star that we think about. It's the stars that we remember that were established 242 years ago when men gathered at a place called Philadelphia. When the year before that, a few men came out at a place called Lexington Green, and they fired a shot that was heard all around the world. And they created a symbol. And those stars on that blue field, that no matter where you go, you know it stands for one single thing: individual liberty and freedom. But this country, the United States of America, would not have been able to be established if it weren't for a man whose life was defined by another star. And that man was Haym Salomon, a Polish-born Jewish businessman who was basically the financier of our Revolutionary War effort. And how incredible when we think about service and sacrifice and commitment, that here was a man who had all the riches and all the resources. But as it said in the Declaration of Independence, how they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, Haym Salomon died in poverty, having given everything he could so that we could be here and live under these incredible stars. Because the original star of liberty and freedom is the star that flies behind me, and that's the Star of David. And when we think about When we think about what it says in Matthew 5:14, when we think about when Ronald Reagan, that great American president, stood and talked about the shining city that sits upon a hill. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know that it sits up upon that hill. If you've ever gone up to the Knesset, you know that it sits upon that highest point there, because there's something about stars that shine bright. Even those of us who call ourselves Christians know that there were wise men that followed a star. That's the intricate relationship between Israel, the United States of America, and the great state of Texas, which you just said is one of the fastest growing Jewish communities and populations in the United States of America. Why? Because people follow a star. And when you think about Texas and the stand made at Masada, it is no different than the stand that was made at Alamo, the stand that was made at Masada. And when you stand there and understand what was done, when the Romans were there and ready to enslave those people, they said, we will not surrender, we will not retreat, we will not give up our freedom. They chose death over servitude, just the same as those 183 chose death over servitude at the Alamo. And so how interesting and how great it is that we have a speaker tonight who brings all of that together in Carolyn Glick. Because Carolyn Glick was born in Houston, Texas. Carolyn Glick was born in a city that is named after the first president of the Republic of Texas. Carolyn Glick was born in a city that was named after the man that whipped old Santa Ana in 18 minutes at San Jacinto. Carolyn Glick is a warrior that went on to serve in the Israeli Defense Force for 5.5 years. Carolyn Glick is a person that understands service, sacrifice, and commitment to the recognizable stars of Israel, of America, and to Texas. I've been with Carolyn Glick on several different occasions, and she's one of the most astute, one of the most dedicated, one of the most patriotic people that you could ever run into. And let me tell you something. She's cut from the mold of old Joshua. She will always be strong. She will always be of good courage. She knows that her Lord, her God, will never leave her nor forsake her. And when she speaks truth. And truth is power as it comes from her mouth. See, they gave me all these nice, things to say and all this stuff. I don't give a damn about this. What I care is that I know her heart. I know that what beats within her heart is the Lion of Judah. So I give to you tonight a daughter of Texas, a daughter of America, a daughter of Israel, a woman that was made for a time such as this. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn Glick.
That was really something. That was really something. I think my father, Gerald Glick, of blessed memory, would have loved to hear that. And then he would have whispered in your ear, that's all a lie. She gave me all my gray hairs. It really is always a pleasure to come to the great state of Texas. My family did live here when I was born at Methodist Hospital in Houston, Texas, a long time ago. And we moved before I had the opportunity to understand how blessed and honored I should feel to have been born here. But when I come here, I always say, oh, now I get it. Now I get it. They put something into the monitor or something in the IV when I was born, and that's why I never did fit in Chicago, and I had to move to Israel. So it's really always a pleasure to come here and speak in Dallas and Texas. And I thank the Michaels for being so stubborn about bringing me here and not taking any excuses. And so thank you for bringing me here. And thank you to Colonel Allen West. I like to rib him and say nasty things to his face, but I always say to when you're at your most vulnerable point and you can't defend yourself, I will say he's one of the most wonderful men I've ever had the honor and pleasure to meet. He said he was talking about me, but he was really talking about himself, all that patriotism stuff, and yeah, that's you.
Do push-ups.
I can't, that's you. You leave me alone now. At any rate, I wanted to talk to you. The planned discussion for this evening was to talk about President Donald Trump's policy towards Israel and how it impacts America. And I think that in a way, this talk and another talk that I gave earlier this week in New York, they were obviously all arranged and scheduled before the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. But in a way, that atrocity makes them a little bit more timely, and unfortunately. But the thing that you think about President Trump, and when you think about his Israel policy, is that you recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong and fake about the conversation that's going on in the United States these days about his foreign policy and about what he means when he talks about making America great again, and when he talks about a nationalist foreign policy and what it means to be a nationalist. See, the conversation here takes all of those terms and turns them on their head and says that they're anti-Semitic, that there's something anti-Semitic about the way that... You guys not hear me? Is that what's going on here? I know, I hear it too. It's ringing in my ear. It's a little bit annoying. So if I scream, it'll just get worse. Anyway, I'm sure that somebody here can take care of the... Now you hear me? All right. The thing that's strange about the conversation in the United States going on about President Trump's Israel policy is that it takes everything in that policy and it turns it on its head. Says that making America great again is somehow or another resonant of Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic diatribes on the eve of the Holocaust. Say that being a nationalist is somehow or another antithetical to being non-bigoted. Or if you are a nationalist, you are a priori an anti-Semite. And so, first of all, to understand what a lie it is, let's just look for a second at what his actual policy towards Israel is, how this impacts the United States of America, and then we can go back and think about what it means to be a nationalist from Trump's perspective, because I think they're all very tied together. So, well, the first thing that Trump did in terms of Israel is he recognized that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And people can't understand why 80% of Israelis love him. Not only did he recognize that Israel's capital is the city of Jerusalem, but he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. And I was there at the embassy opening, one of the biggest thrills of my life. And then, just a couple of weeks ago, he said that the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, which was operating in defiance of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, the American consul general in Jerusalem did not submit his accreditation to the president of Israel like every diplomat that's accredited to serve in the state of Israel does. In defiance of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, they refused to be accredited by the government of Israel because the American consulate was based upon the presumption that the United States didn't recognize Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. So following the move of the embassy 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the United States was subordinating the consulate in Jerusalem to the embassy in Jerusalem. In other words, what you have is full American recognition of Israel's capital. On the other side, you ended the free ride that the past 3 administrations have given to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The United States, the President of the United States signed the Taylor Force Act, which ends the United States funding to the Palestinian Authority so long as they continue to use budgetary funds to pay the pensions and the salaries of terrorists and their families that are convicted of terrorist crimes and sitting in Israeli prisons. Until now, the United States was underwriting those payments. That's over. The United States defunded UNRWA, which is the Palestinian refugee agency that spreads some of the most vile and genocidal anti-Semitism throughout Palestinian society and throughout the Arab world inside of the UN-run refugee camps from Lebanon to Damascus, Syria to Iraq, and so on and so forth. So the United States isn't funding the hate anymore. The United States pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council, which was an organization that whose founding the United States spearheaded during the Bush administration, because the UN Human Rights Commission was so inherently and institutionally anti-Semitic that the United States couldn't stand to be in it anymore. So then they founded the UN Human Rights Council, but then they weren't able to join it in the Bush administration because it too was inherently and institutionally anti-Semitic. But the Obama administration joined it anyway. Right. So that was over now, thanks to President Trump, who pulled the United States out of it. The United States has provided unconditional support to Israel in our defense against our enemies, whether in Syria or in Gaza or in Lebanon or beyond. We don't have to worry when our jets go flying over to attack Iranian targets inside of Syria that the United States is going to say that both sides have to exercise restraint. Same goes for Israel's counter-terror operations against the Hamas regime in Gaza. I'm just going to go on. There's another list. We're working our way through it. The United States has been cultivating the ties that Israel began developing with the Sunni Arab states during the Obama years. This was actually an extraordinary act of statesmanship by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. When Obama was president, he began turning away from America's traditional Arab allies, Egypt and the Sunni Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and towards Iran, Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, Hamas. So what was interesting was that you had this sort of strange alliance that was kind of built based upon a common sense of betrayal by the United States of America between Israel and the Saudis and the Egyptians, the UAE. We saw this alliance, working alliance, not so partnership, come to bear during Operation Protective Edge, the war in 2014 between Israel and Hamas, where when the United States supported Turkey and Qatar and Hamas and their ceasefire demands for Israel, Israel was able to stop Kerry and Obama from forcing their way through by using a blocking belt of the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the UAE, who supported Israel against Hamas, much to the amazement of the Obama administration. Well, the Obama administration tried to attenuate those ties. Didn't work because of mutual concern over Iran. Instead of doing that, the Trump administration, President Trump came into office and he made his first trip abroad to where? Saudi Arabia and Israel, underscoring his commitment to strengthening the working alliance that had been built during the Obama years between Israel and the Sunni states. This is a tremendously important strategic shift. The administration recognized it and began doing everything that it could in order to advance it. We saw last week or was it this week? I can't remember. Israel's Minister of Sports and Culture, Miri Regev, was in Abu Dhabi for the World Judo Championships. She handed out the medals when the Israeli judoka Sagi Muki won the gold medal. They played Hatikva in Abu Dhabi. They said, oh, she was crying when they played Hatikva, but then I watched it on YouTube and I started crying, so I could totally understand her. It was amazing. And then it happened again the next day. We got a second gold medal. And they played Hatikva again, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the guy's name. In Abu Dhabi. Amazing. If you think that the Americans weren't involved in it, I think that you're missing a point here. Same thing, Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Oman for an official visit last week, something that's never happened before. And the United States supports this wholeheartedly. Then, of course, you have the biggie, aside from Jerusalem, Iran. For 8 years under Obama, and the last 2 years, I dare say, of the Bush administration, you had American administrations who were pushing to appease Iran, particularly the Obama administration, obviously. In 2015, you had an administration who concluded a deal with the Iranians that gave them an open road to a nuclear arsenal that enriched them to the tune of $150 billion in sanctions relief and direct money that was given in cash to the mullahs on American planes. You had the United States supporting Iranian ascendants in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and beyond. The unthwarted, unchallenged rise of Iran as a hegemonic power that threatened the destruction of Israel and the Sunni Arab regimes that had been American allies since the end of World War II. It was the most destructive policy both to American national security interests and to the United States' alliance structure in the Middle East and to everything that the United States is supposed to value. First and foremost, preventing the proliferation of the world's most dangerous weapons to the world's most dangerous regimes. And that was the centerpiece of Obama's foreign policy. To advance this policy, the Obama administration engaged in rank anti-Semitic rhetoric in Washington, accusing congressmen and senators who did not support the deal of being in the throes of foreign influence and controlled by foreign donors, with the undertone always being clear that it was the Jews that were putting them up to it. AIPAC members had their phone lines illegally wiretapped and saw their internal conversations that had been intercepted illegally by the Obama administration then published the next day in the Washington Post. Is this the thing? Yeah, it's gone. But do you still hear me? Do I have to start again? It's a long, long list, but I'm just getting the highlights. What did President Trump do? He walked away from the deal. Everybody told him not to do it. Everybody told him he couldn't do it. Everybody told him it would be Armageddon if he did it. And he did it. Because he understood something very basic. When you strengthen your enemies and weaken your friends, your enemies become stronger and more powerful enemies, and your friends become weaker and less defensible. When you strengthen your friends and you fight your enemies become weaker and your friends become stronger. Now, I was never very good in math when I was in high school, but I'm pretty sure that adds up to a very positive return when your friends are strong and your enemies are weak. I don't know why that's so hard for them to understand in Washington, D.C., but we have a lot of people in Israel who share that same neurosis. But psychosis. But President Trump understood it. He understood it. That you stand with your friends and you stand against your enemies, because then people will want to be your friends and they won't want to be your enemies. And they call him a simpleton. All right, then. Now, when you think about it, and again, this is just the list of the things that, I could think of offhand while I was on the plane. This is an extraordinary list. This is an extraordinary list of achievements. This is an extraordinary policy. We've had a lot of presidents who were supportive of Israel. And you could pick and choose from this list, and they may have done one or two of these things. But the idea that in the first 2 years in office, one president has done all of these things, and has done all of these things consistently, and without anybody pushing him, and without billions of dollars or millions of dollars in lobbying fees and AIPAC conventions, and congressional delegations to the White House having to come and making treaties, but doing it on his own, and with no fanfare whatsoever, just announcing, okay, I'm moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about all of this? This is the apotheosis of MAGA policy. This is exactly what he's talking about. Why? Because when you stand with your friends, you're great. And what's the thing about standing with Israel? And we saw this again. We see this with anti-Semitism against Israel, against American Jewry, against European Jewry, against Jewry in general. Israel is the most demonized, the most stigmatized, the most delegitimized country on the face of the earth. So to stand with Israel is hard, right? You don't want to stand with a guy who's always bullied, To stand with that guy takes courage. To stand up against the crowd that wants to attack him and persecute him. Standing up for the little guy is not easy, but it's the American way. And when you talk about nationalists versus globalists, when you're talking about going against the grain or going with the flow, that's what you're talking about, because the flow is anti-Semitic. When you stand up against it and you stand with the Jews, you're standing up for yourself when you're America. Because you're saying, wait a minute, we have interests and we have values. And we have a perception of the way things should be in this world. And we're going to stand by a country that shares all of those things with us, even if they don't like it in Brussels. So when President Trump says he's a nationalist and not a globalist, he's not being anti-Semitic. He's fighting anti-Semitism. A lot of us in Israel have been long arguing that the United States is always at its best and always most powerful and successful when it stands with Israel. And we pare down to the bare reasons why it is, the pragmatic reasons, so that even secular humanists can understand now. We share a same perception of the way things ought to be because we have the same values. We have the same enemies. You have friends. We don't have any friends. But we have you, and you're a friend. Where does it come from? Oh, that's the thing the secular humanists don't like to go to, right? But it comes from the Common Core. The Common Core isn't just Aeschylus and Plato and Aristotle. The Common Core is God. Let's give it up for God. You know, it's interesting. We in the book of Genesis we're reading in synagogue now, and it's an interesting book because it seems so out of place. Is what Rashi said, the great Torah scholar Rashi. He started his first commentary of the Bible, the first verse of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So Rashi said, what is this doing in the Bible? So the first verse of the Bible is a law book. Why didn't it start with Exodus? Why didn't it start with the Ten Commandments? Why did it start with the beginning of the world? So he has an interesting explanation. I have other explanations, but he's got a good explanation. He says it's because he had to start the story with the creation of the universe, with the creation of the world, with the creation of the Jewish people, from Adam to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Because by starting it with the story of the patriarchs and the matriarchs in the land of Israel and the promise that Hashem gave to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob that they would inherit this earth, nobody could say we stole it. I love Texas. So we think about a lot of reasons and we give a lot of rationalization and we explain a lot, but at the basic core, there are two things about America, or there's one thing about these two nations, the American nation and the Jewish nation, that distinguish us from all the other nations of the world. Do you know what they are? We created ourselves, or were created by God, or both, with a vision of how the world should be, and a vision of how we wanted to be as nations, right? We defined ourselves as Jews at Mount Sinai when we accepted the Torah, and we define ourselves as Jews as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We did these acts that were the acts of national self-determination at our inception. This is who we are. We are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this is our law, the law of Moses, law of God. And what did the Americans do? What did the founding fathers of this country do? The Constitution and the Bill and the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is self-determination. This is the credo of America. These are two nations that determined who they were and invented themselves, defined who they are on the basis of their relationship with God and with man. Did this happen in France? Did this happen in Belgium? No. Did this happen in Egypt? Did this happen in Saudi Arabia? No, 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 no. So when you understand the basic concept of America, the basic concept of Israel was self-determination in relation to God and to man, and we came up with very similar understandings of those relationships, you also understand why we are such natural allies. And you understand why it is that central to President Trump's foreign policy is his support for Israel. He talks about moving the embassy to Jerusalem more than he talks about almost any other foreign policy initiative he's undertaken as president. I dare say he even talks about it more than he talks about his opening to North Korea. And when you think about it from a geostrategic perspective, why would he care so much about moving an embassy to Jerusalem, this puny little country, 6,000 miles away from Washington, D.C.? What is it so important when North Korea is threatening to nuke Hawaii and Guam? Because he sees, he understands that the war against Israel is central to the way that people think of the United States. And how America stands towards Israel is going to define whether it's going to lead or pretend to lead and call it leading from behind. And so we come back to these allegations of President Trump, these extraordinary slanders of President Trump, that he is an anti-Semite, and that these are being made by people who consider themselves leaders of the Jewish community. You know, it strikes me as extraordinary, really. There was an article in the Atlantic Monthly that was published by Franklin Foer, the former, I think he's the former editor of the New Republic, came out just hours after the massacre. And he said that the first takeaway lesson from the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue is that Jews who support Trump should be shunned by American Jewish community, that they should be banned from praying in synagogue, that their charity should not be accepted by synagogues. This is pure incitement, right? But Jeff Goldberg thought it was worth publishing, which I also thought was interesting. So, is it not an American Jewish interest for the United States to stand with the Jewish state? Is it not a communal interest for the United States to recognize Jewish history and the 3,000-year attachment of the Jewish people to the city of Jerusalem? Is it not an American Jewish communal interest to have Israel be strong and supported by the United States when it fights enemies who want to annihilate it? Is it not an American Jewish interest to have the United States stand against anti-Semitism in the United States and throughout the world? Instead of calling a massacre of Jews in a Paris kosher mart a bunch of guys in a deli? It's not an American Jewish interest to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons instead of giving them an open road to the bomb? Of course, all of these things are in the interest of the American Jewish community, and all of these things are being advanced by President Trump. And Israelis, 80% of Israeli Jews they don't just support President Trump, they love him. And we love him because he's shown through his actions, not through his words. He barely speaks about it. Well, he does, but it's not very coherent. He's not that. He's not a poet, but that's all right. He's a doer. And he's done more in 2 years than any president has done for Israel. And no, I'm not giving him carte blanche. If he comes up with the deal of the century, which I think sucks, I'll tell him publicly. If that deal of the century is not good, I'm going to let him have it. And so will the rest of the Israelis. But that's not the point. The point is what he's already done has been extraordinary. And he deserves credit for it, and he deserves support for it. And the notion that this man had anything to do with the actions of a Nazi who walked into a synagogue and butchered 11 elderly Jews in prayer is obscene. He stood with Israel and he stands with Israel, and we owe it to him to stand with him when he's under attack, because that's what friends do. So we owe him a great deal, and we can see that the United States really is respected in the world today in a way that it wasn't respected 3 years ago. We see that the United States is feared by its enemies in a way that it wasn't 3 years ago, when America's enemies laughed at the United States and didn't take seriously American threats and took American sailors hostage in the Gulf and then humiliated them by filming them at their weakest and most vulnerable moments. This was contempt. This was the wages of that Iran deal. You don't hear about too much Iranian messing with American ships in the Persian Gulf and in the Straits of Hormuz anymore, do you? And you don't hear too much about ISIS taking territory in Syria and in Iraq anymore, do you? Because that territory has been taken away from them by the United States. People are afraid of the United States when they should be, and they look to the United States for inspiration and for hope as they once did again. That's what it means to make America great again. And the key ingredient to that I put before you that the key ingredient to that success is Donald Trump's policy towards the state of Israel. So thank you. And thank you, Texas. And by the way, aside from Donald Trump, Israel's second best president in the United States? Ted Cruz. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn Glick. Hey, wait, don't go anywhere. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, let's see some questions and answers. So we have a few minutes left. We'd like to turn this opportunity over to you to have a question or two for the great Carolyn Glick. No? Sorry. One too many. So what I'll do is I'll come over here. Hang on a second. His hand was first. I'll be right back to you, Diane. Yes, sir.
A few questions.
Please, a question.
Huh?
Okay.
Oh, I have water? Oh.
It was reported by ADA that during 2017, there were reported almost 2,000 cases of anti-Semitism. It is an increase of 57%. I mean, you know that. Given that, how you can explain that 75% of American Jews still support party of Louis Farrakhan?
Okay, if I understood correct, he asked me, why is it that 75% of the American Jewish community support the Democrats? I guess the easy answer to that is old habits die hard. But, I think that there is a problem here with the Democratic Party, and I think that a lot of this radicalization was propelled forward by the Obama administration, in a sense.
Yeah.
By mainstreaming anti-Semitism during the Obama years, particularly in 2015 during the fight against the Iran nuclear deal, or fight for it, the Obama administration unleashed a lot of demons that should have been left chained to their dungeon door. And when Alan West was talking at dinner about Louis Farrakhan, who just referred to the Jews as termites, he's not an anti-Semite, he's an anti-termite. Oh, how cute. And Andre Carson, by the way, said that last year. He called us termites. He's a congressman from Indiana, which is a great state, by the way, but he's not a great congressman. He's certainly an anti-Semite. And you see that there are half a dozen Democratic nominees for Congress, at least 3 of which are guaranteed to be elected next week, who are out-and-out anti-Zionists, anti-Semites. They want the annihilation of Israel. They support the annihilation of the largest Jewish community in the world, and they support the ostracization of all American Jews who support Israel. That is, they're out-and-out anti-Semites. And they're about to be elected to Congress as Democrats. What's her name? Ocasio-Cortez. Tom Perez called her the future of the party. I mean, aside from being incoherent and completely ignorant, she knows that what she's supposed to be is anti-Israel. and she is anti-Israel. And this is a frightening thing. And you see a situation that, from an Israeli perspective, and I dare say from a rational perspective, is becoming less and less understandable, which is this continued allegiance to a party that no longer feels allegiance towards you.
Ms. Diane.
Okay. All right. You buckle belt, and
I didn't hear anything. What?
we are very okay. I wanted to say I welcome you back home to the Buckle of the Bible Belt. We are very, very proud as B'nai Zion to be a co-host for the evening. Recently, you were asked to speak at the University of Texas. We're very concerned about our young generation. Why were you not able to speak there?
So here's a nice story that I can share with you. So I was invited to speak at the University of Texas in Austin in November 2016, right after the election. I was supposed to speak there at Hillel. And it was actually an interesting thing, which was that I was disinvited by Hillel. And they couldn't get a Jewish group who would sponsor me. There kept being Jewish groups who would sponsor me, and then they were intimidated by other Jewish groups that said that they would be boycotted if they sponsored me. So I went through AIPAC and J Street, and which I understand that the University of Texas and Austin are the same organization, more or less, or at least they were 2 years ago. And Chabad tried to hold it, and they threatened the Chabad rabbi, and it was all just sort of didn't work out. And what I understood from that is that the BDS has been so successful on the University of Texas at Austin campus and on many other campuses as well, that the invitations to people who are pro-Israel are simply not given anymore. And we saw it at Princeton this year when the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel was disinvited by Hillel. She was invited, then she was disinvited, and she ended up speaking at Chabad. And I think that it happened either to her, to other Israelis. Amit Deri's reservists on duty. They go and they defend the Israeli Defense Forces against all of the libels against our soldiers. They were disinvited from speaking at Stanford. And so it's really a rising reality on campuses that if you are pro-Israel, the Jewish students won't dare to invite you. And part of that is also because the Jewish students themselves are undergoing indoctrination to make them not understand anything and to think that there's something wrong with being pro-Israel. So they're internalizing the prejudice against them. It's very dangerous, because if people aren't allowed the opportunity to gain knowledge, then guess what? They won't get it. And so, yes, what happened to me at University of Texas was unfortunate. And it would be nice if somebody could go speak to the students and tell them the truth about Israel and the Jewish people, because they deserve to know.
What is your question for Ms. Glick?
I just wanted to ask or mention, as we know, we're having an election coming up next week, and I worry about if we don't win now, or if we will lose in 2 years from now, if a backlash of anti-Israel policy will be worse than the Obama administration.
Oh, yeah, I think that Obama is going to be remembered well as a Zionist president once Elizabeth Warren becomes president. There is a disturbing trend towards radicalization and anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party, and it's becoming more and more clear, to the point where even the New York Times wrote an article about it a week and a half ago. This is an amazing thing, and this is one of the things that I've been advocating for years, both primarily during the Obama years, but even during the Bush administration years, which is that Israel has to change and its perceived dependence on the United States in military assistance, and that we should transform our military relationship with the United States from one of aid recipient to partner in research and development. Because when you're looking at the fact that, you have such a divided country, and really you have a division over values and the perception of what it means to be an American and what America is, you understand that the alliance that the United States and Israel shared is now an alliance increasingly that Israel shares with the Republican Party. And this is a disaster for the United States. And it's a disaster for Israel. So, we have to be able to weather any storm. That means that we have to take maximum advantage of the fact that we have such a genuine friend and ally in the White House now to prepare for what may be around the corner. But it's really up to the American people to turn this around. I mean, I'll tell you, Israel went through this in the 1990s with the peace process with the Palestinians. Our society was nearly torn apart. Particularly, you saw the height of it in 2005 with the expulsion of the Jews of Gaza by the Sharon administration, which embraced the policies of the radical left and called for and enacted the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, even though it was clear that Gaza would become completely controlled by terrorists of the PLO or Hamas version. It really didn't matter from Israel's perspective the minute that we left. And Israeli society was on the verge of civil war. Perpetually almost since 1993 with the handshake on the White House lawn between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And today we have a society that is stronger than it ever was before. We emerged from that struggle more united, more committed to the future of our country and to our past and to our present as Jews than we ever have been before. Israel today is, you don't even want to say it out loud because you're afraid of tempting fate. But we have over $40,000 in per capita income. We've surpassed Japan. We've never been so educated in terms of higher education, educated in terms of Torah education, and prosperous at any time in Jewish history, ever. Tfu, tfu, tfu. But you have to understand that none of this seemed possible in 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. None of this seemed possible in 2002 when Jews were being murdered in the streets of every city, in the cafes of every town, in their homes. None of this seemed possible. It all seems impossible until it becomes inevitable. And so many Israelis took it upon themselves and saw it as their own personal responsibility to save our country and to save our society. And you had initiatives being taken by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individual Israelis to take our country back. And a million different miracles that happened, and a million different accomplishments that coalesced into what we're seeing today in Israel. And this is something that Americans are faced with today, 25 years after we were, and it's the same kind of responsibility that Americans have to take on themselves to save this country, to bring it back from the brink of civil war, to bring it back to where it's supposed to be, and with renewed faith in the majesty of America, in the greatness of the ideals that are the anchor of this country, the foundations of this idea of the American people and the American way. I mean, I never thought I would be able to say what and feel and believe what I see is happening in Israel after 70 years of independence, and it is a miracle through and through. But Abraham Lincoln said this is the almost chosen people. And maybe chosen differently, self-selected, and divinely inspired. So that means that everybody has to do his and her part to make sure that this continues and long endures. And I think that with people like you, it'll definitely happen.
What is your question?
Hi, Caroline. I am interested to get your thoughts on Jewish identity when it comes to the different streams of Judaism and the American Conservative Synagogue. You might know that the Jewish community in Uganda had their first birthright trip, and they are having a little trouble getting visas for their rabbinical students. I was just wondering if you had any opinions or advice for them.
I didn't hear what you said. What is something about rabbinical students?
Ugandan rabbinical students were having trouble with visas, and she wanted to know about the different sects of Judaism in America and so on and so forth, and that Uganda had just had its first.
Well, I guess that the problem is that you have non-Orthodox conversions being undertaken in Uganda and other African countries, and the fear of the Ministry of the Interior is that, if you recognize these conversions from Africa, you're going to have Africa moving to Israel, and so this is becoming more of an immigration issue than a tourism issue, and so I think that that's really what's going on here. The trouble getting visas has to do with the trouble with understanding whether this is an immigration or whether this is tourism. And I think that right now the Ministry of the Interior has come down on the side that this is an attempt through the back door to immigrate into Israel.
What is your question, ma'am?
Caroline, what would you like to see the U.S. and President Trump do about the scourge that is Gaza? What position?
Well, I think that the only, Israel is not a country. I mean, the United States has a much larger military than Israel does, obviously. And, the U.S. wasn't able to competently and for a long period of time control militarily Iraq. It's just not something that democracies are very good at, and it's something that is very difficult to undertake under the best of circumstances, and you're never under the best of circumstances. I think under the circumstances that exist now in Gaza, it would make little sense for Israel to reassert its control over Gaza. The war would be too costly and the returns would be too small. The real answer for Gaza is to have the president of Egypt, Sisi, open up the border to the Sinai, because you have in the northern Sinai an underpopulated area which doesn't have workers for jobs to have economic development. They have gas fields there and oil fields that Israel gave back to the Egyptians under the peace treaty. And you have in Gaza an enormous population that doesn't have jobs and has no economic prospects whatsoever, which is why they can be used as cannon fire by Hamas in their escapades along the border with Israel. So the answer to Gaza in the long term and in the medium term and really in the short term is to open up the border with northern Sinai. And if you can see even an economic integration of the economies of Gaza and the northern Sinai, you'll see two things. You'll see massive emigration out of Gaza to Egypt or to anywhere else in the world. Right now, they're not allowed to go anywhere. And so they're essentially a captive population to Hamas. And you'll also see a stabilization of Gaza and a weakening of Hamas, because one of the ways that Hamas wields power is because it has complete control over the economy, such as it is of Gaza. There is no economic opportunity there, and so the ability to remain above the ability to avert starvation among Gazans is based upon supporting Hamas terror, because Hamas commits acts of terror, demands gas, demands cash, gets money from Qatar, gets gas for their electricity to power their powerhouses, and then they avoid starvation by attacking, by throwing missiles at Israel, through extortion. The minute that you give them another opportunity, you've already watered down Hamas's grip on power and Hamas's ability to wage war against Israel. So I think that the real key to Gaza is Egypt.
Your question, sir. We got time for one or two more. What is your question?
Hello, Carolyn. I'm Pastor Scott Sigmund with my wife Lydia, and we represent Pastors Larry and Tiz Huck and New Beginnings Church and multitudes of people that are pro-Israel and pro-Jewish. My question is, could you explain a little bit about the dangers of a two-state solution and why we need to support an undivided Jerusalem?
I'll be happy to, Pastor, and thank you for your support for Israel. So I'm just going to say very briefly, I wrote a book about it, which I understand we had a hard time getting out here, and apologize for that. We were hoping to be able to sell you all copies of it, but there was some problem with Barnes & Noble's, which I think you can still order it on Amazon, no problem, and probably on Barnes & Noble's website as well. So I apologize for not being able to sign them for you. But, let me just, I think that to understand what the problem with the two-state solution is, you have to understand the rationale at its core, okay? So the rationale at the core of the two-state solution, so-called, is this notion that the problem that you have to solve is the absence of an Arab state west of the Jordan River. And that concept is, to put it bluntly, deeply bigoted against Israel. Now, why is that? The two-state solution posits that the root cause of the Arab world's rejection of Israel and its war against Israel is the absence of an Arab state west of the Jordan River. And that Arab state is supposed to be located on lands that Israel controls. Meaning that the two-state solution is predicated on the notion that the party that is guilty and responsible for the absence of peace in the world, in the region, is Israel. Israel controls land that the Arab state is supposed to be located on, and therefore there is no peace, meaning that Israel is greedy. Israel is avaricious. And it stubbornly clings to land that if it just gave away, peace would reign. We have, when he was president, Bill Clinton said that he believed that 90% of the terrorism, not only in the world, in the region, but throughout the entire world, would disappear once there is a Palestinian state. So Bill Clinton said that he thought that 90% of the terrorism in the world was Israel's fault. Did he realize that he was saying that? I don't think so. I think that it has become such common wisdom, this two-state solution thing, that people don't realize that what they're advancing is a notion that is inherently anti-Semitic. There you go. So when you ask, what's wrong with the two-state solution? The problem is that it's predicated in a misperception, an inherently bigoted misperception, but a misperception of the pathologies of the Middle East. Because as we all know, the reason that there is no peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and there's no real peace even between Israel and the Arab countries that signed peace deals with Israel. 100% of Jordanians told Pew surveyists in 2014 that they hate Israelis, that they hate Jews. 100%. 100%. 100% of Jordanians said they hate Jews. I mean, just get your arms around that. And they have a treaty of peace with us. Egypt is much more tolerant. You know how many Egyptians hate Jews? 97%.
Yeah.
It's not bad. The other 3% are cops. Probably. No, just kidding. But anyway, so...
What is your question, sir?
Just one comment about that two-state solution. I asked people if when Israel united Jerusalem, did they defeat a Palestinian army? No, they defeated a Jordanian army. And during the 19 years that Jordan controlled Jerusalem, did the Palestinians complain that it was their capital? Not once. But here's my question. Yesterday, the Palestinian Central Council revoked the Paris Economic Protocols that are the agreement which the PA and Israel use for cooperation. And they came out with a statement that they oppose Trump's peace plan, even though the peace plan has not been presented publicly. Where are they leading with this? They're slitting their own throats.
You know, they asked Begin what he thought of the Iran-Iraq war. And he said, I wish both sides the best of luck. Any more questions?
Does anybody have any question over here? This is one section that I've neglected. Somebody's got a question. You gotta stand up and say something, or I'll go to the other tribe. You know, on the other side of the aisle. Here we go. All right. This will be our last question tonight.
What comes after Mahmoud Abbas with the PA?
I didn't hear what you said.
What comes after Mahmoud Abbas?
You know, I think that one of the things that's very telling is that we care. Because, you know, it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz, right? Everybody was thinking that they had to get the answer from the wizard, and then it worked out it was that fat guy behind a drapery with, you know, whatever. So the point is that it was nothing. And we've convinced ourselves for all of these years that we must get approval from the PLO. What? Really? You know, the truth is that what we've been experiencing from them, and I was in the talks when I was in the Army for 3 years. In my last 3 years of the Army, I was the coordinator of the negotiations with the Palestinians in the Defense Ministry on civil affairs. And, you know, one of the things that I did in my spare time, which I had none of, but whatever, was I, very annoyingly to a lot of the generals, kept putting out these reports documenting Palestinian breaches of the agreement, that we were negotiating with them. Because what we discovered was that they were breaching every single material clause in all of the agreements, that, you know, every commitment that they had taken upon themselves, they were not fulfilling. Everything that we had committed ourselves to do, they were demanding the fulfillment of. Everything that served their interests, they were doing. Everything that was antithetical to their interests, they weren't doing. And this was a strategic breach, and, you know, it was consistent from the very start, from 1994 on. I was writing these things between 1994 and 1996. So at the height of all of the utopian fantasy of peace with the PLO, they were breaching everything. When we think about Abu Mazen, what we're thinking about is a projection of our own desires onto somebody who's never been anything but our enemy. And we say, oh, well, we have great security cooperation with him. But he needs that security cooperation more than Israel does. Because the Hamas in Judea and Samaria threatens him first, and then it threatens Israel. Sometimes they work together and they carry out terrorist attacks with one another in conjunction, you know, in cooperation with one another against Israelis. They do that too. But the fact that we get security cooperation with the PLO against Hamas does not mean that the PLO is pro-peace. It means that the Hamas, as we saw in Gaza, is stronger than the PLO is. So when we think, oh, they abrogate the Oslo agreements, well, they've never kept them. They've been in material breach of those agreements since the moment that they signed them. What they're carrying out now is not the agreement. What they're doing now is they're advancing their own interests, sometimes in conjunction with Israel, generally not. And this will continue even if tomorrow Abbas abrogates the deal, so-called, because it's a joke that he's abrogating them. It's only we in our fantasy that he's going to be a partner for peace one day, that we pretend that this is not the case, but this has always been the case. So What comes after Abbas? I don't know, but I think that we should be planning for the day after because, the possible successors to this guy, one of them is in jail, Marwan Barghouti, the head of Fatah. He's in jail for 5 counts of murder, of terrorist murder. He was actually the mastermind of the terror war that began in 2000, and the fact that we were only able to pin 5 counts of murder on him doesn't mean that he's not responsible for the death of hundreds of Israelis. He is. He's a mass murderer. And so that would be a great peace partner. Then we have Jibril Rajoub, who is the head of the preventive security force in the Hebron area, who is a murderer. That would be great. And then we have another one that actually, it's good friends. He lives in the UAE. He was the head of the security of Gaza for many years, named Mohammed Dakhlan. He's a murderer. So, murderer. And that's it. So I think we shouldn't be siding with any of them. And none of them will be any good. And all of them will be bad. All of them are terrorists. None of them support Israel. None of them support peaceful coexistence with the Jewish state. None of them want to have a Palestinian state that lives at peace with Israel. All of them want to have a state that supplants Israel. So there's not a really good deal for Israel to be had here. So what do we care? I think that the idea is you just let things wither on the vine by not feeding them. Don't give them any more money. Don't give them any more political legitimacy. Don't pretend that they're abiding by an agreement. And just let it die. Just walk away. That's what's going to happen. I hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, she is Carolyn Glick. Louder.
What?
Louder.
Oh.
Yelling now. Now yelling. Okay, good.
Now yelling on one foot.
Yeah, now yelling on one foot. Okay, yeah.
Just kidding.
All right, now Carolyn ran out of books before she got here. Okay, so she doesn't have any books.
No books.
The good news is that Colonel Allen West has books. And he would love to sign those books and talk with you way into the wee hours of the morning, so line up.
In your pocket.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, one other thing. I would have a book to sign, but they haven't figured out how to recreate crayon on the page. So, look, thanks very much for joining us for this wonderful evening. If you would like a professional photo of yourself with Ms. Glick, she is willing to pose, but be mindful there are 400 of us. Barnes & Noble is here. No, they're not. May God bless and keep you. May he keep Texans, the citizens of the United States of America, and our brethren in the holy state of Israel safe and secure. Our father Jacob prayed, may the Lord bless you, be gracious toward you. May he turn his face to you and bless you with peace. God bless all of you. God bless Israel. Thanks for coming. Good night.